The United States federal debt exceeds $36 trillion. The annual deficit is $2 trillion. Interest payments alone are $1 trillion per year and rising. These aren't estimates or projections. These are current numbers. Current reality. Do the math. If the government collects roughly $4 trillion in annual revenue and spends $6 trillion, the gap is $2 trillion. That gap must be borrowed. The debt grows. Interest compounds. Eventually, interest payments consume more than the government can collect in taxes. At that point, the math breaks. Something must give. The government faces exactly three options. Default. Stop paying debt entirely. Politically impossible for a reserve currency issuer. Default destroys international credit, access to capital markets, and confidence in the currency itself. No government chooses this unless forced. Inflate, print money, devalue currency, make debt cheaper in real terms. Politically easier because it's invisible to most people. Inflation destroys savers and fixed-income earners but allows the government to service debt with cheaper dollars. Restructure, rewrite the debt. Tell creditors they're getting less than promised. Politically painful but mathematically clean, governments never admit beforehand which option they'll choose. They claim they'll manage responsibly. They promise fiscal discipline. They insist the math will work out. In 1982, Brazil's government officials confidently stated they would honor all debt obligations. They had sustainable plans. They would manage the crisis. 6 months later, Brazil declared default and restructured debt. Creditors took losses. The game changed. Same pattern in Argentina 2001. Government officials promised debt would be honored. Within weeks, they imposed capital controls and restructured. Savers lost their savings. Currency collapsed. Lebanon 2019. Government promised stability. Banks became insolvent. Depositors couldn't access funds. Default happened. Greece 2015. Government promised debt would be manageable. Restructuring followed. Creditors took 50% haircuts. The pattern is consistent across decades and continents. Officials make confident promises. The math breaks. The government implements the escape plan. Savers and creditors bear the cost. Your government is making the same promises every government made before defaulting on debt. History shows what happens next. But before we understand how governments escape debt, we need to understand why debt becomes inescapable. Governments don't accidentally accumulate unsustainable debt. The mechanism is structural and documented. It follows a predictable pattern every time. First, debt is cheap when credit markets believe you're solvent. Governments borrow at low rates because lenders believe repayment is safe. A solvent government borrows at 2 to 3%. An insolvent government borrows at 10 to 15% or can't borrow at all. When markets trust you, borrowing is attractive. Second, this low-cost borrowing makes deficit spending politically irresistible. Why raise taxes when you can borrow? Why cut spending when you can borrow? Borrowing is easier than both alternatives. Raising taxes costs votes. Cutting spending costs votes. Borrowing costs nothing politically. So governments borrow. Third, compounding creates the trap. If debt grows faster than the economy, eventually interest payments exceed the government's ability to service them. The math is simple. If debt grows at 5% annually and the economy grows at 2%, debt is growing 2.5 times faster than the ability to pay. Eventually, this gap becomes UNBIDGEABLE. Watch the timeline. Year 1, debt is 50% of GDP. Affordable. Year 5, debt is 75% of GDP. Still manageable. Year 10, debt is 100% of GDP. Getting problematic. Year 15, debt is 150% of GDP. Now unsustainable. At 150% debt to GDP, interest payments consume 10 to 15% of government revenue. Normal functions get squeezed. Defense, healthcare, infrastructure, pensions all compete for what's left. The government faces a choice. Cut spending dramatically, politically impossible. Raise taxes dramatically, economically damaging. Or restructure debt, technically defaulting. No option is painless. Current data confirms the trap exists now. Japan is at 260% debt to GDP, sustained only through financial repression. The US is trending toward 150% by 2050. EU. Nations are above 100%. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. These are current conditions. How did this happen? Post-2008, governments borrowed to prevent depression. Post-2020, governments borrowed to prevent pandemic collapse. Post-2022, governments borrowed to manage rising rates. Each borrowing cycle was justified at the time. Each one made future restructuring more likely. Governments claim they'll manage debt responsibly. The math shows restructuring is inevitable. By the time debt becomes obviously unsustainable, the restructuring window is closing. Early movers escape better than late movers. So when debt becomes mathematically inescapable, what methods do governments actually use to escape it? Inflation is the stealth default. The government doesn't technically renege on debt. It just devalues the currency the debt is denominated in. A government that borrows $1 trillion at 2% interest, when inflation is 2%, has effectively zero real debt cost. The debt doesn't grow. But if inflation rises to 10% while interest stays at 2%, the government has negative real debt cost. It's repaying the debt with cheaper dollars. Every year, the real burden shrinks. History documents this clearly. U.S. inflation in the 1970s was partly structural oil shocks, wage spirals, but it was partly intentional. Federal Reserve leadership later admitted the goal was to break inflation expectations by letting it run hot, then aggressively tightening. The effect, real debt burden on government decreased while savers and fixed income earners were destroyed. Japan did this from 1990 to 2020, 30 years of near-zero interest. Rates and periodic inflation allowed the government to maintain 260% debt to GDP without restructuring. The mechanism worked. The cost was paid by savers through negative real returns. Modern central banks openly discuss inflation as debt management. The language is sanitized. We target 2% inflation. But the mechanism is clear to strategists. Target 5 to 7% inflation for 5 years. You reduce real debt by 25 to 35% without any formal default or restructuring. Documented examples. U.S. 1970s inflation reduced real debt despite nominal debt increasing. UK post-World War II inflation eroded 260% nominal debt to manageable levels within a decade. Japan's lost decades. Sustained low-rate environments allowing debt servicing despite unsustainable nominal levels. Mechanism 2. Financial RPR SIO and financial repression forces savers into government debt at below market rates. The government doesn't cut debt. It makes debt cheaper to service by controlling interest rates and forcing capital into government bonds. Mechanism. Central bank maintains artificially low interest rates below inflation. Banks are required to hold government bonds. Pension funds are incentivized to buy government debt. Capital controls prevent money from fleeing. Result: government borrows at artificially cheap rates while savers earn negative real returns. Japan perfected this. Bank of Japan holds over 50% of outstanding government bonds. Interest rates are negative in real terms. Japanese savers earn nothing on savings. The government maintains 260% debt through financial repression. Us is implementing mild financial repression. Federal Reserve currently holds $5 trillion in assets, much government debt. This suppresses rates below free market levels. The effect? Government debt is cheaper to service than it otherwise would be. Historical precedent. Post-World War II, UK used financial repression to manage 260% debt. Forced savers into low-yield government bonds. Within a decade, debt became manageable through growth and inflation. Mechanism 3. Explicit RESTRING. Sometimes the math breaks too fast for inflation or repression. The government must explicitly restructure. This means telling creditors, we're reducing what we owe you. Argentina 2001. Government owed $144 billion. Could not pay. Restructured debt. Creditors took 70 to 75% haircut. Some received nothing. The restructuring was traumatic but necessary. Greece 2015. Private sector. Creditors took 50% haircut. Official creditors were protected. The restructuring was presented as austerity but was actually debt relief. Lebanon 2019 present. Government defaulted on sovereign debt. Restructuring ongoing. Creditors negotiating recovery rates. Explicit restructuring is politically costly. It's technically default. Credit ratings tank. Future borrowing becomes expensive. But sometimes it's the only math that works. When does it happen? When inflation and repression can't close the gap fast enough. When creditor confidence breaks. When capital flight accelerates. Mechanism for currency diabac related to inflation but more extreme. Government stops backing currency with anything. Prints money to pay debt. Currency collapses. Debt denominated in collapsed currency becomes worthless. Zimbabwe, 2008. Government printed currency to pay debt. Currency lost value 99.9%. Debt became worthless. Venezuela 2016 to 2020. Similar process. Hyperinflation made debt denominated in bolivars essentially worthless. Modern currency. Debasement, excessive money printing. Currency peg breaks, capital controls, currency replacement at unfavorable exchange rates. This is hyperinflation's extreme form. Economically destructive but mathematically eliminates debt. Mechanism. 5. Default and EXCLUSION simplest mechanism. Government stops paying debt. Creditors lose. Government excludes itself from credit markets and survives on what it can tax. Russia. 1998. Defaulted on ruble debt. Credit ratings crashed. Eventually rejoined markets at much higher borrowing costs. Argentina 2001. Similar pattern. Defaulted, restructured, eventually rejoined markets. Default is costly short-term but mathematically clean. You stop owing what you can't pay. Governments claim they'll repay all debt. History shows they use one of 5 mechanisms to escape repayment. The escape mechanism your government will use determines who bears the cost. Savers, borrowers, retirees, and workers experience different impacts, but here's what's crucial to understand. Governments don't publicly discuss which escape mechanism they'll use. They reveal it through policy. Governments telegraph their escape plan through policy. You just need to read the signals correctly. Signal 1, interest rate policy. If central bank maintains rates below inflation, financial repression is the plan. The government is signaling, savers will lose real value. Your savings will be repressed to service government debt. Japan's signal has been consistent for 30 years. Negative real rates. Savers earning nothing. U.S. Federal Reserve signal since 2008 has been mixed but leaning toward repression. Rates stayed below inflation for most of the recovery period. Signal 2, monetary supply growth. If money supply grows faster than GDP, inflation is the plan. The government is signaling, we'll inflate away the debt. Watch central bank balance sheet growth, money supply metrics, inflation expectations, market pricing. When these accelerate simultaneously, inflation is the intended escape. The U.S. showed this signal aggressively post-2020. Money supply doubled while GDP growth remained modest. Signal 3, capital controls. If government restricts capital outflows, financial repression is being enforced. Capital controls prevent savers from fleeing to foreign assets. Lebanon implemented capital controls to force savers to hold Lebanese pound debt at below market rates. This signals, your money stays here, earning low returns, servicing government debt. When you see capital controls, financial repression is being locked in. Signal 4, debt restructuring discussions. If government officials start talking about restructuring opportunities or debt sustainability frameworks, explicit restructuring is being prepared. Greece talked about restructuring for 2 years before implementing it. Argentina did the same. The public discussion is preparation. Markets see it coming. Creditors adjust positions. When restructuring finally happens, it's expected, not shocking. Signal 5, currency debasement preparation. If government discusses currency modernization or central bank digital currencies with restrictions on cash, currency debasement may be planned. If government is hoarding foreign currency while spending domestic currency aggressively, debasement may be the plan. Venezuela showed these signals years before hyperinflation accelerated. Signal 6, exclusion from credit markets. If government stops borrowing and starts taxing aggressively, default and exclusion may be the plan. Russia did this after 1998 default. Government shifted from borrowing to surplus budgets and started rebuilding credit reputation gradually. Current signals. U.S. shows signals 1 and 2 repression and inflation. Japan shows signals 1 and 2 continuing. EU shows mixed signals. Some countries showing signal 1, others showing signal 3. This indicates different escape mechanisms for different governments. Pre-Argentina 2001, government showed no explicit restructuring signals. Default shocked markets. Pre-Greece 2015, government showed clear restructuring signals for 2 years. Restructuring was expected. Governments don't announce restructuring. They implement it through policy signals that reveal the escape plan months in advance. If you understand the signals, you can reposition before restructuring. If you don't, restructuring hits you unprepared. Understanding these mechanisms and signals reveals something about who bears the cost when debt becomes unpayable. Governments telegraph their escape plan through policy. You just need to read the signals correctly. Signal 1, interest rate policy. If central bank maintains rates below inflation, financial repression is the plan. The government is signaling, savers will lose real value. Your savings will be repressed to service government debt. Japan's signal has been consistent for 30 years. Negative real rates. Savers earning nothing. U.S. Federal Reserve signal since 2008 has been mixed but leaning toward repression. Rates stayed below inflation for most of the recovery period. Signal 2, monetary supply growth. If money supply grows faster than GDP, inflation is the plan. The government is signaling will inflate away the debt. Watch central bank balance sheet growth, money supply metrics, inflation expectations, market pricing. When these accelerate simultaneously, inflation is the intended escape. The U.S. showed this signal aggressively post-2020. Money supply doubled while GDP growth remained modest. Signal 3, capital controls. If government restricts capital outflows, financial repression is being enforced. Capital controls prevent savers from fleeing to foreign assets. Lebanon implemented capital controls to force savers to hold Lebanese pound debt at below market rates. This signals, your money stays here, earning low returns, servicing government debt. When you see capital controls, financial repression is being locked in. Signal 4, debt restructuring discussions. If government officials start talking about restructuring opportunities or debt sustainability frameworks, explicit restructuring is being prepared. Greece talked about restructuring for 2 years before implementing it. Argentina did the same. The public discussion is preparation. Markets see it coming. Creditors adjust positions. When restructuring finally happens, it's expected, not shocking. Signal 5, currency debasement preparation. If government discusses currency modernization or central bank digital currencies with restrictions on cash, currency debasement may be planned. If government is hoarding foreign currency while spending domestic currency aggressively, debasement may be the plan. Venezuela showed these signals years before hyperinflation accelerated. Signal 6, exclusion from credit markets. If government stops borrowing and starts taxing aggressively, default and exclusion may be the plan. Russia did this after 1998 default. Government shifted from borrowing to surplus budgets and started rebuilding credit reputation gradually. Current signals. U.S. shows signals 1 and 2 repression and inflation. Japan shows signals 1 and 2 continuing. EU shows mixed signals. Some countries showing signal 1, others showing signal 3. This indicates different escape mechanisms for different governments. Pre-Argentina 2001, government showed no explicit restructuring signals. Default shocked markets. Pre-Greece 2015, government showed clear restructuring signals for 2 years. Restructuring was expected. Governments don't announce restructuring. They implement it through policy signals that reveal the escape plan months in advance. If you understand the signals, you can reposition before restructuring. If you don't, restructuring hits you unprepared. Understanding these mechanisms and signals reveals something about who bears the cost. When debt becomes unpayable, every debt escape mechanism transfers cost to someone. Understanding who pays helps you avoid being the one paying. Inflation and repression, savers and fixed income earners pay. Borrowers benefit. Workers with wage-indexed income benefit. Asset holders benefit. Real estate and stocks appreciate in nominal terms. The transfer flows from savers to debtors, from creditors to borrowers, from fixed income earners to workers with wage leverage. A retiree on fixed pension loses purchasing power. A government borrower refinances debt at lower real cost. Asset owners see nominal wealth increase even as real wealth stagnates. Explicit restructuring. Creditors pay. Bondholders lose value. Countries and institutions that hold government debt as savings lose. Pensioners whose pension funds hold government bonds lose. But the government becomes solvent and can service remaining debt. The transfer flows from creditors to citizens, from bondholders to taxpayers. A pension fund that holds Greek bonds took 50% haircut in 2015. The government reduced obligations and continued functioning. Currency debasement. Everyone with currency-denominated savings pays. Foreign creditors lose their claims, are worth less in devalued currency. Domestic savers lose savings, lose purchasing power. Workers with fixed contracts lose wages, become worthless in devalued currency. But government debt becomes worthless too, so government is solvent relative to the remaining population. The transfer flows from currency holders to government. Default. Creditors pay. Government loses credit access. Population loses credit availability. But government doesn't have to service debt. The transfer flows from creditors to government, from financial system to government. Historical documentation confirms the pattern. Argentina 2001. Savers lost through currency debasement and restructuring. Asset owners benefited. Cheap assets became expensive in new currency. Workers lost initially as currency collapse made imports expensive, but eventually benefited as currency debasement made exports competitive. Japan, 1990 to 2020. Savers lost through negative real returns. Borrowers benefited from cheap debt. Government benefited from sustainable debt load. The transfer was from savers to government and borrowers. Lebanon, 2019-present. Savers lost through bank account haircuts. Borrowers benefited as debt was forgiven. Government reduced obligations. The transfer was from savers to government. The key insight: the escape mechanism determines who bears cost. Savers, workers, retirees, and creditors experience different impacts, depending on which mechanism is used. Every government claims it will protect savers and workers. Every debt escape transfers cost to one of these groups. If you understand which escape mechanism is coming, you can position before the cost transfer happens. This raises the question, what's coming for your country's debt situation? Current debt exceeds $36 trillion. Annual deficit is $2 trillion. Interest payments are $1 trillion annually and rising. Policy signals are clear. Federal Reserve maintaining below inflation rates. Signal 1, repression. Money supply growth in excess of GDP growth. Signal 2, inflation. Treasury extending debt maturity, preparing for higher rates. The conclusion is unavoidable. The U.S. is signaling inflation plus repression escape mechanism. Savers will bear the cost through negative real returns. This is Japanification strategy. The U.S. is following Japan's model from 1990 to 2020. Sustain unsustainable debt through repressed rates and periodic inflation while savers lose purchasing. The EU debt situation varies by country. Germany shows conservative fiscal policy and low debt, no escape mechanism needed. Italy carries 140% debt with mixed signals. France shows 110% debt, displaying signal 1, repression, as ECB keeps rates low. Southern Europe shows signal 4, restructuring discussions. The conclusion: EU is fragmenting on escape mechanisms. Northern Europe is avoiding restructuring. Southern Europe may face explicit restructuring within the next decade. Debt reaches 260% of GDP. Policy signals are consistent. Sustained low rates, signal 1. Periodic inflation targeting, signal 2. Capital controls on yen movement, signal 3. Japan has fully committed to repression plus inflation escape. The mechanism will be sustained indefinitely. The cost is paid by savers through negative real returns and lost purchasing power. Many are showing signal 5, currency debasement preparations, through capital controls and currency volatility. Some are showing signal 4, restructuring discussions. Currency-denominated debt is particularly vulnerable to debasement. When foreign creditors hold debt in local currency, that debt becomes worthless if currency collapses. Current policy signals reveal a consistent pattern. Developed nations are choosing repression plus inflation over explicit restructuring. This is politically easier. Explicit restructuring requires admitting default. Inflation and repression happen quietly. Cost falls on savers, not creditors. Cost falls on ordinary people, not politically powerful institutions. Your government's debt escape plan is already being implemented through policy. Most people don't recognize it because it's methodical, not dramatic. The cost transfer is happening now. The window to reposition is closing. Understanding this pattern reveals something uncomfortable about how governments actually work.